Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer, where we last left off in Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. The vermicious Canids were defeated, burning up in the Earth's atmosphere, and the commuter capsule and everybody inside it was saved. And now we're finally back in the chocolate factory. I wonder what's gonna happen now that they're back. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 12. Back to the Chocolate Factory. Crash! And then the noise of splintering wood and broken glass and absolute darkness and the most awful crunching sounds as the elevator rushed on, smashing everything before it. All at once the crashing noises stopped and the ride became smoother and the elevator seemed to be traveling on guides or rails, twisting and turning like a roller coaster. And when the lights came on, Charlie suddenly realized that for the last few seconds he hadn't been floating at all. He had been standing normally on the floor. Mr. Wonka was on the floor too, and so was Grandpa Joe and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and also the big bed. As for Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George, they must have fallen right back onto the bed, because they were now all three on top of it and scrambling to get under the blanket. "We're through!" yelled Mr. Wonka. "We've done it! We're in!" Grandpa Joe grabbed him by the hand and said, "Well done, sir! How splendid! What a magnificent job!" "Where in the world are we now?" said Mrs. Bucket. "We're back, Mother!" Charlie cried. "We're in the chocolate factory." "I'm very glad to hear it," said Mrs. Bucket. "But didn't we come a rather long way around?" "We had to," said Mr. Wonka, to avoid the traffic. "I have never met a man," said Grandma Georgina, "who talks so much absolute nonsense." "A little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men," Mr. Wonka said. That's what Gene Wilder said in the 1971 version of Willy Wonka. "Why don't you pay some attention to where this crazy elevator's going?" shouted Grandma Josephine, "and stop footling about." "A little footling roundabout will stop you going up the spout," said Mr. Wonka. "What did I tell you?" cried Grandma Georgina. "He's round the twist. He's bottled as a beetle. He's bogged as a beetle. He's dotty as a dingbat. He's got rats in the roof. I want to go home." "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "We're here." The elevator stopped. The doors opened, and Charlie found himself looking out once again at the great chocolate room with the chocolate river and the chocolate waterfall, where everything was eatable. The trees, the leaves, the grass, the pebbles, and even the rocks. And there to meet them were hundreds and hundreds of tiny Oompa Loompas, all waving and cheering. It was a sight that took one's breath away. Even Grandma Georgina was stunned into silence for a few seconds. But not for long. Oh, look at them all. So happy. "Who in the world are all those peculiar little men?" she said. "They're Oompa Loompas," Charlie told her. "They're wonderful. You'll love them." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, Charlie, their drums are starting up. They're going to sing." "Hallelujah," sang the Oompa Loompas. "Oh, hallelujah and hooray, our Willy Wonka's back today. We thought you'd never make it home. We thought you'd left us all alone. We knew that you would have to face some frightful creatures up in space. We even thought we heard the crunch of someone eating you for lunch." All right, shouted Mr. Wonka, laughing and raising both hands. "Thank you for your welcome. Will some of you please help to get this bed out of here?" 50 Oompa Loompas ran forward and pushed the bed with the three old ones in out of the elevator. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, both looking completely overwhelmed by it all, followed the bed out. Then came Grandpa Joe, Charlie, and Mr. Wonka. "Now," said Mr. Wonka, addressing Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, Up you hop out of that bed, and let's get cracking. I'm sure you all want to lend a hand running the factory. Who, us? Said Grandma Josephine. Yes, you, said Mr. Wonka. You must be joking, said Grandma Georgina. I never joke, said Mr. Wonka. Now, just you listen to me, sir, said old Grandpa George, sitting up straight in his bed. You've gotten us into quite enough troubles and trumbles for one day. I've gotten you out of them now, I've gotten you out of them too, said Mr. Wonka proudly, and I'm going to get you out of that bed as well. You see if I don't. Chapter 13. How Wonkavite was invented. I haven't been out of this bed in 20 years, and I'm not getting out of it, and I'm not getting out now for anybody, said Grandma Josephine firmly. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. You were out of it just now, every one of you, said Mr. Wonka. That was floating, said Grandpa George. We couldn't help it. We never put our feet on the floor, said Grandma Josephine. Try it, said Mr. Wonka. You might surprise yourself. Go on, Josie, said Grandpa Joe. Give it a try. I did. It was easy. We're perfectly comfortable where we are, thank you very much, said Grandma Josephine. Mr. Wonka sighed and shook his head very slowly and very sadly. Oh well, he said, so that's that. He laid his head on one side and gazed thoughtfully at the three old people in the bed, and Charlie, watching him closely, saw those bright little eyes of his beginning to sparkle and twinkle once again. Aha, thought Charlie, what's coming now? I suppose, said Mr. Wonka, placing the tip of one finger on the point of his nose and pressing gently. I suppose, because this is a very special case, I suppose I could spare you just a tiny little bit of... He stopped and shook his head. A tiny little bit of what? Said Grandma Josephine sharply. No, said Mr. Wonka, it's pointless. You seem to have decided to stay in that bed no matter what happens. And anyways, the stuff is much too precious to waste. I'm sorry I mentioned it. He started to walk away. Hey, shouted Grandma Georgina. You can't start something and not go on with it. What is too precious to waste? Mr. Wonka stopped. Slowly he turned around. He looked long and hard at the three old people in the bed. They looked back at him, waiting. He kept silent a little longer, allowing their curiosity to grow. The Oompa Loompa stood absolutely still behind him, watching. What is this thing you're talking about? Said Grandma Georgina. Get on with it, for heaven's sake, said Grandma Josephine. Very well, Mr. Wonka said at last. I'll tell you. And listen carefully, because this could change your whole lives. It could even change you. I don't want to be changed, shouted Grandma Georgina. May I go on, madam? Thank you. Not long ago, I was fooling about in my inventing room, stirring stuff around and mixing things up the way I do every afternoon at 4 o'clock, when suddenly I found I had made something that seemed very unusual. This thing I had made kept changing color as I looked at it, and now and again it gave a little jump. It actually jumped up in the air as though it were alive. What have we here? I cried, and I rushed it quickly to the testing room and gave some to the Oompa Loompa who was on duty there at the time. The result was immediate. It was flabbergasting. It was unbelievable. It was also rather unfortunate. What happened? Said Grandma Georgina, sitting up. What indeed? Said Mr. Wonka. Answer her question, said Grandma Josephine. What happened to the Oompa Loompa? Ah, said Mr. Wonka. Yes. Well, there's no point in crying over spilt milk, is there? I realized, you see, that I had stumbled upon a new and tremendously powerful vitamin, and I also knew that if only I could make it safe, if only I could stop it doing to others what it did to that Oompa Loompa. What did it do to that Oompa Loompa? Said Grandma Georgina sternly. The older I get, the deafer I become, said Mr. Wonka. Do please raise your voice a trifle next time. Thank you so much. Now then, I simply had to find a way of making this stuff safe. so that people could take it without what? Snapped Grandma Georgina. Without a leg to stand on, said Mr. Wonka. So I rolled up my sleeves and set to work once more in the inventing room. I mixed and I mixed. I must have tried just about every mixture under the moon. By the way, there is a little hole in one wall of the inventing room which connects directly with the testing room next door, so I was always able to keep passing stuff through for testing to whichever brave volunteer happened to be on duty. Well, the first few weeks were pretty depressing, and we won't talk about them. Instead, let me tell you what happened on the 132nd day of my labors. That morning, I had changed the mixture drastically, and this time the pill I produced at the end of it was not nearly so active or alive as the others had been. It kept changing colors, yes, but only from lemon yellow to blue, then back to yellow again. And when I placed it in the palm of my hand, it didn't jump about like a grasshopper. It only quivered, and then ever so slightly. I ran into the hole of the wall that led to the testing room. A very old Oompa Loompa was on duty there that morning. He was a bald, wrinkled, toothless old fellow. He was in a wheelchair. He had been in the wheelchair for at least 15 years. Yeah, he does look pretty old there. This is test number 132, I said, chalking it up on the board. I handed him the pill. He looked at it nervously. I couldn't blame him for being a bit jittery after what had happened to the other 131 volunteers. What had happened to them? Shouted Grandma Georgina. Why don't you answer the question instead of skidding around it on two wheels? Who knows the way out of a road, said Mr. Wonka. So this brave old Oompa Loompa took the pill, and with the help of a little water he gulped it down. Suddenly the most amazing thing happened. Before my very eyes, queer little changes began taking place in the way he looked. A moment earlier he had been practically bald, with just a fringe of snowy white hair around the sides and the back of his head. But now the fringe of white hair was turning gold, and all over the top of his head new gold hair was beginning to sprout like grass. In less than half a minute he had grown a splendid new crop of long golden hair. At the same time, many of the wrinkles started disappearing from his face. Not all of them, but about half, enough to make him look a good deal younger. And all of this must have given him a nice tickly feeling, because he started grinning at me, then laughing, and as soon as he opened his mouth I saw the strangest sight of all. Teeth were growing up from those old toothless gums. Good white teeth, and they were coming up so fast I could actually see them getting bigger and bigger. Look at him now. He looks younger. I was too flabbergasted to speak. I just stood there with my head poking through the hole in the wall, staring at the little Oompa Loompa. I watched him slowly lifting himself out of his wheelchair. He tested his legs on the ground. He stood up. He walked a few paces. Then he looked up at me, and his face was bright. His eyes were huge and bright as two stars. "Look at me," he said softly. "I'm walking. It's a miracle." "It's Wonkavite," I said. "The great rejuvenator. It makes you young again. How old do you feel now?" He thought very carefully about this question. Then he said, "I feel almost exactly how I felt when I was 50 years old." "How old were you just now before you took the Wonkavite?" I asked him. 70 last birthday, he answered. "Really? I thought he was older than that." "That means," I said, "it has made you 20 years younger." "It has!" he cried, delighted. "I feel as frisky as a frog hopper." "Not frisky enough," I told him. 50 is still pretty old. Let's see if I can't help you little bit more. Stay right where you are. I'll be back in a little twink." I ran to my workbench and quickly made one more pill of Wonkavite, using exactly the same mixture as before. "Swallow this," I said, passing the second pill through the hatch. There was no hesitating this time. Eagerly he popped it into his mouth and chased it down with another drink of water. And behold, within half a minute, another 20 years had fallen away from his face and body, and he was now a slim and sprightly young Oompa Loompa of 30. He gave a whoop of joy and started dancing around the room, leaping high in the air and coming down on his toes. "Are you happy?" I asked him. "I'm ecstatic," he cried, jumping up and down. "I'm happy as a horse in a hayfield." He ran out of the testing room to show himself off to his family and friends. Oh, look at him, so happy. Thus was Wonkavite invented, said Mr. Wonka, and thus it was made safe for all to use. "Why don't you use it yourself, then?" said Grandma Georgina. "You told Charlie you were getting too old to run the factory. So why don't you just take a couple of pills and get 40 years younger? Tell me that." "Anyone can ask questions," said Mr. Wonka. "It's the answer that counts. Now then, if the three of you in the bed would care to try a dose." "Just 1 minute," said Grandma Josephine, sitting up straight. "First I'd like to take a look at this 70-year-old Oompa Loompa who is now back to 30. Mr. Wonka flicked his fingers. A tiny Oompa Loompa, looking young and perky, ran forward out of the crowd and did a marvelous little dance in front of the three old people in the bed. 2 weeks ago he was 70 years old and in a wheelchair, Mr. Wonka said proudly, and look at him now. "The drums, Charlie," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, they're starting up again." Far away down on the bank of the Chocolate River, Charlie could see the Oompa Loompa band striking up once more. There were 20 Oompa Loompas in the band, each with an enormous drum twice as tall as himself, and they were beating a slow, mysterious rhythm that soon had all the other hundreds of Oompa Loompas swinging and swaying from side to side in a kind of trance. They began to chant. "If you are old and have the shakes, if all your bones are full of aches, if you can hardly walk at all, if living drives you up the wall, if you're a grump and full of spite, if you're a human parasite, then what you need is Wonkavite. Your eyes will shine, your hair will grow, your face and skin will start to glow. Your rotten teeth will all drop out, and in their place new teeth will sprout. Those rolls of fat around your lips will vanish, and your wrinkled lips will get so soft and rosy pink that all the boys will smile and wink, and whisper secretly that this is just the girl they want to kiss. But wait, that is not the most important thing of which to boast. Good looks you'll have, we've told you so, but looks aren't everything, you know. Each pill as well to you will give an extra 20 years to live. So come, old friends, and do what's right. Let's make your lives as bright. Let's take a dose of this delight, this heavy magic dynamite. You can't go wrong, you must go right. It's Willy Wonka's Wonkavite." Chapter 14. Recipe for Wonkavite. "Here it is," cried Mr. Wonka, standing at the end of the bed and holding high in one hand a little bottle. "The most valuable bottle of pills in the world. And that, by the way," he said, giving Grandma Georgina a saucy glance, "is why I haven't taken any myself. They are far too valuable to waste on me." He held the bottle out over the bed. The three old ones sat up and stretched their scrawny necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the pills inside. Charlie and Grandpa Joe also came forward to look. So did Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. The label said, "Wonkavite. Each pill will make you younger by exactly 20 years. Caution. Do not take more than the amount recommended by Mr. Wonka." They could all see the pills through the glass. They were a brilliant yellow, shimmering and quivering inside the bottle. Vibrating is perhaps a better word. They were vibrating so rapidly that each pill became a blur and you couldn't see its shape. You could only see its color. You got the impression that there was something very small but incredibly powerful, something not quite of this world, locked up inside them and fighting to get out. They're wriggling, said Grandma Georgina. I don't like things that wriggle. How do we know they won't go on wriggling inside us after we swallow them? Like those Mexican jumping beans of Charlie's I swallowed a couple of years back. You remember that, Charlie? I told you not to eat them, Grandma. They went on jumping about inside me for a month, said Grandma Georgina. I couldn't sit still. If I'm going to eat one of those pills, I sure as heck want to know what's in it first, said Grandma Josephine. I don't blame you, said Mr. Wonka, but the recipe is extremely complicated. Wait a minute, I got it written down somewhere. He started digging around in the pockets of his coat tails. I know it's in here somewhere, he said. I couldn't have lost it. I keep all my most valuable and most important things in these pockets. The trouble is, there's such a lot of them. He started emptying the pockets and placing the contents on the bed. A homemade catapult, a yo-yo, a trick fried egg made of rubber, a slice of salami, a tooth with a filling in it, a stink bomb, a packet of itching powder. It must be here. It must, he kept muttering. I put it away so carefully. Ah, here it is, he folded a crumbled up piece of paper, smoothed it out, held it up, and began to read as follows. Recipe for making Wonkavite. Take a block of finest chocolate weighing 1 ton, or 20 sackfuls of broken chocolate, whichever is easier. Place chocolate in very large cauldron and melt over a red-hot surface. When melted, lower heat slightly so as not to burn the chocolate, but keep it boiling. Now add the following, in precisely the order given, stirring well all the time and allowing each item to dissolve before adding the next. The hoof of a manticore, the trunk and the suitcase of an elephant, the yolks of 3 eggs from a wiffle bird, a wart from a warthog, the horn of a cow, it must be a loud horn, the front tail of a cockatrice, 6 ounces of sponge from a young slime scrapper, 2 hares, and 1 rabbit from the head of a hippocampus, the beak of a red-breasted wilbatross, a corn from a toe of a unicorn, the 4 tentacles of a quadrupus, the hip and the paw and the pot of a hippopotamus, the snout of a prog-hopper, a mole from a mole, the hide and the seek of a spotted wangdoodle, the whites of 12 eggs from a tree squeak, the 3 feet of a snozwanger. If you can't get 3 feet, 1 yard will do. It's the same thing. But anyways, the square root of an American abacus, the fangs of a viper, it must be a windshield viper, windshield viper, the chest and the drawers of a wild grout. When all the above are thoroughly dissolved, boil for a further 27 days, but do not stir. At the end of this time, all liquid will have evaporated, and there will be left in the bottom of the cauldron only a hard brown lump about the size of a football. Break this open with a hammer. In the very center of it you will find a small round pill. This pill is Wonkavite. All of that chocolate to make one tiny little pill. To be continued.